A colony can starve surrounded by honey. It can freeze without ever reaching freezing temperatures. And it can die in a well-insulated hive, while an uninsulated hive 50 meters away survives the same winter intact. Have you seen this in your own colonies? If you have opened a hive in late February or early March and found a cluster of dead bees surrounded by capped stores, bees that should have survived, then you have witnessed a failure that has nothing to do with cold and everything to do with moisture. If this channel has helped you understand your colonies better, consider supporting it with a like before we continue. The mechanism that killed those bees was not temperature. It was condensation, water, moisture produced by the cluster itself, unable to escape, dripping back onto the bees from the inner cover above, chilling them from the outside in, at temperatures that should not have been fatal. This failure is not new. It was documented by commercial apiarists in the 1880s and 1890s, cataloged, studied, and eventually solved. The solution did not require expensive equipment. It required understanding one physical principle that most modern beekeeping guidance has quietly abandoned: dead air. What most beekeepers misunderstand is this: insulation is not protection from cold. Insulation is management of thermal exchange. And when that management traps moisture instead of releasing it, the insulation itself becomes the cause of collapse. To understand why dead air worked, and why its abandonment has cost small producers measurable losses, we need to understand what a winter cluster actually is biologically. A winter cluster is not a dormant mass. It is an active thermogenic system. The bees on the interior of the cluster vibrate their flight muscles continuously, generating heat without flying. That metabolic activity produces two outputs: warmth and water vapor. A colony of 20,000 bees in midwinter can release significant moisture into the hive environment through respiration alone. That vapor rises in a sealed or poorly ventilated hive, particularly one insulated with impermeable materials. That vapor contacts the cold inner cover and condenses. The water pools. It drips. A water droplet falling onto the winter cluster from above does not simply wet the bees. It drops the local temperature of the cluster surface. Bees cannot generate sufficient heat to recover when wet. They contract further into the cluster, away from the moisture, which may mean moving away from their stores. Isolation from stores, combined with chilling, produces the late winter starvation alongside honey scenario that confuses beekeepers every spring. The cluster was not starving. It was retreating. More bees. Less survival. The moisture did the work the cold never could. By the 1890s, commercial apiaries operating across northern Europe and the northern United States had developed winter management protocols that addressed this problem directly. These were not small operations. These were apiaries managing hundreds of colonies across difficult climates, where winter losses translated directly into lost spring production and lost seasonal income. They could not afford to lose colonies to preventable mechanisms. Their method was not foam, it was not polystyrene, it was not sealed vapor barrier insulation of any kind. It was packing, specifically the deliberate creation of dead airspace around and above the cluster using loose, breathable organic material. Dry wood shavings, compressed straw, cork granules, dry sphagnum moss in some northern operations. The material itself was secondary. The principle was constant. Trap still air, allow vapor to migrate. Do not seal. Dead air. Air that does not circulate, that is not in contact with a thermal bridge, has an insulating value that rivals modern synthetic materials. A 10-centimeter layer of dry wood shavings can hold an R value equivalent to several centimeters of closed-cell foam. But it does something foam cannot do. It breathes. Vapor produced by the cluster migrates slowly outward through the packing material, dispersing before it can condense on a single cold surface. The inner cover above the packing remains relatively dry. Condensation does not pool. Water does not drip. The cluster can maintain its core temperature, typically between 20 Celsius and 35 Celsius, 68 VLF to 95 VLF at the cluster center, with the outer shell permitted to fall as low as 8 Celsius to 10 Celsius, 46 VLF to 50 VLF, without fighting moisture at the same time. This is thermal regulation without thermal sealing. It is a distinction that cost practitioners decades to relearn after synthetic materials replaced organic packing in mainstream beekeeping. Let us be precise about what happens inside the hive at critical temperature thresholds. When ambient temperatures outside the hive fall below 0°C 32 FFE, the cluster contracts. The outer bees press inward. Density increases. Metabolic heat production increases proportionally. This is a functional response. The colony is regulating. At sustained temperatures below -10 Celsius, 14 atf, cluster contraction becomes maximal. The bees are now generating the most heat they are capable of producing collectively. They are also producing the most water vapor per unit of time. This is the point at which the insulation design matters most. A hive insulated with impermeable boards, foam panels fastened tightly around the brood box, inner cover sealed against moisture escape, reaches peak vapor pressure precisely when the cluster is working hardest. The physics are simple. Warm air holds moisture. That air rises. It contacts a cold surface. The moisture drops out, it falls. A hive packed with dead air material, loose shavings above the frames, a moisture quilt box or traditional straw cushion against the inner cover, allows that vapor to diffuse. No single surface reaches saturation, no pooling occurs. The cluster works without fighting its own respiration. The difference in late winter survival rates across historical commercial records was not marginal. In documented accounts from Northern European apiaries of the 1890s through 1910s, operations using dead air packing consistently reported late winter losses below 10% in severe seasons. Operations transitioning to tighter, warmer, sealed winter wraps, believing more insulation meant more protection, saw losses climb. The mistake was intuitive. Warmer should mean safer, but the mechanism does not respond to warmth. It responds to moisture. Growth without timing is loss. Warmth without vapor management is damage. The bees that died were not cold. They were wet. For a beekeeper managing between 5 and 50 colonies, the seasonal income implications of this failure pattern are direct and significant. Winter losses do not only cost the colony, they cost the spring buildup. They cost the foraging force that should have been expanding in March and April. They cost the frames of brood that should have been producing the nurse bees that feed the summer population that works the main nectar flow. A colony lost in February does not simply represent one dead hive. It represents the complete production chain that hive would have initiated. For a small producer dependent on a short flowering window, linden, acacia, borage, clover, each colony that fails to winter successfully is a direct subtraction from the only income window the season offers. This is why the dead air principle mattered commercially in the 1890s. These beekeepers were not operating from sentiment. They were protecting production continuity across a complete seasonal chain. A winter colony that survived intact required no spring replacement, no purchased package, no lost buildup time. It began expanding immediately as temperatures allowed, producing the population surge that the main flow required. The intervention cost was negligible. Dry wood shavings, straw, cork, material that cost almost nothing, applied once before the first hard frost, removed after the last one. That equation has not changed. The practical application of dead air winter management follows a consistent protocol that can be adapted to most standard Langstroth configurations. The timing of application is as important as the material. Dead air packing should be added when ambient daytime temperatures have stabilized below 10°C, 50 FFF, and the colony has reduced or ceased brood rearing. In most temperate climates, this window falls between mid-October and early November. Applying packing before the colony has contracted for winter risks trapping warmth that the colony does not yet need, potentially extending brood rearing past its optimal cutoff point. The application sequence runs as follows. Inspect the colony before winter preparation begins. The cluster should be covering at least 6 to 8 frames, with capped honey stores visible on frames flanking the cluster. A colony that enters winter covering fewer than 5 frames is a risk colony, regardless of insulation strategy. Address population weakness before winter preparation. A dead air cushion cannot compensate for insufficient cluster mass. Remove the inner cover. Place a moisture management layer directly on top of the top bars. In historical practice, this was a burlap-wrapped cushion filled with dry wood shavings or compressed straw, approximately 8 to 10 centimeters deep. In modern equivalents, a simple quilt box, a shallow super filled with wood shavings and covered with breathable burlap, performs the same function. The material sits loose enough to allow vapor migration, dense enough to trap still air. The purpose of this layer is not to add heat. It is to prevent the condensation contact point from being the inner cover. Vapor rising from the cluster enters the packing material. It disperses horizontally through the shavings. It reaches the inner cover as dispersed humidity rather than concentrated vapor. Condensation does not pool. Above the packing, the inner cover, if present, should include a small upper entrance or vent slot. Not for airflow, for vapor exit. A slot of 5 to 8 millimeters is sufficient. It does not chill the cluster. The cluster is 10 centimeters below, buffered by dead air, but it allows the dispersed vapor to exit the hive rather than recycling back downward. The outer cover sits above this system unchanged. No exterior foam wrap is required. No plastic sheeting. No tight vapor barrier of any kind. The bottom entrance can be reduced to 25 millimeters or less, primarily for mouse exclusion. Full closure of the bottom entrance is not recommended. A small lower exit provides the pressure differential that allows vapor to migrate upward through the packing rather than pooling at the cluster level. Do not inspect during application beyond a visual check. Do not open the cluster. Do not disturb the winter configuration once it is established. Inspection intervals in winter should be auditory, a gentle knock on the hive side, not visual. A healthy cluster will respond with a brief audible hum. A colony that does not respond warrants cautious observation from the entrance only. Removal of the packing follows the same temperature logic as its application. When daytime temperatures begin holding consistently above 10 cc 50 SFF, in most temperate climates, late February to mid-March, the packing can be removed. Do not wait for brood rearing to resume before removing it. A colony that has already initiated spring brood under winter packing is generating its own heat efficiently and no longer requires the buffer. Delayed removal risks thermal stress from overheating in early spring sun, which can be as disruptive to brood development as cold. Remove. Inspect, assess cluster position and store levels. Resume normal inspection intervals as the season progresses. This is where the historical record becomes instructive in a way that technical manuals often are not. The commercial apiarists of the 1890s who developed and refined dead air packing were not responding to a theoretical problem. They were responding to repeated, documentable losses that occurred specifically in colonies that were otherwise well managed. The bees were healthy going into winter. The stores were adequate. The queens were productive. And still, in late February, the losses came. It took systematic comparison. Operations running packed colonies alongside unpacked colonies across multiple seasons to isolate the mechanism. The variable was not colony strength, it was not store volume, it was not exterior temperature, it was vapor management. The narrow window between cluster health and cluster failure in late winter is measured in days, not weeks. A colony losing cluster cohesion due to moisture stress in mid-February may appear recoverable. By early March, the damage is complete. The bees that should have been expanding toward spring brood production are instead contracting, failing to move, failing to feed, and dying in place. That window is not visible from the outside. It is not apparent at a glance through the entrance. It requires understanding the mechanism that drives it, and building a management system that addresses the mechanism before the window closes. The flowering season does not wait for colony recovery. Acacia blooms for 10 to 14 days in most temperate climates. Linden for less. The colony that emerges from winter compromised by late winter moisture stress does not rebuild foraging force in time for the first major flow. It rebuilds in time for nothing. Narrow window. No adjustment available. The mistake happened weeks earlier. The practical implication for modern beekeepers is not complicated, but it requires a deliberate reassessment of what insulation means in a biological context. Modern beekeeping supply catalogs offer foam-based hive wraps, polystyrene hive bodies, and sealed insulation kits. These products are marketed on the logic that warmer colonies consume less winter stores and survive better. That logic is partially correct. A thermally stable colony does consume fewer stores over a long winter, but thermal stability achieved through vapor-impermeable materials trades one problem for another. The colony may be warm, it will also be wet, and at the temperatures and durations involved in a full northern winter, that trade is consistently unfavorable. The dead air approach does not attempt to maximize warmth. It attempts to stabilize the thermal moisture balance, the relationship between heat retention and vapor dissipation, within a range the cluster can manage without additional physiological cost. It costs less to implement. It requires no proprietary equipment. It can be built from materials available at any farm supply store. And its operating principle, still air, vapor migration, no condensation pooling, is the same principle that allowed commercial apiaries of the 1890s to winter hundreds of colonies reliably through climates that should not have permitted it. The bees have not changed. The cluster still produces heat through muscle vibration. It still produces vapor through respiration. It still requires a thermal environment it can regulate without fighting moisture simultaneously. The physics have not changed either. Dead air insulates. Vapor migrates through breathable material. Condensation does not form on distributed surfaces. The cluster survives the window. The spring buildup begins on schedule. The foraging force reaches the main flow intact. Timing decides. Biology leads. The packing is how the beekeeper adjusts.